1, 2, 3, 4.
Hi, and welcome to the Vininspo podcast with me, Ed Merrison. This is where wine is a travel experience. Join us as we pick up bits and pieces, make new friends, and create memories that make our future interactions with wine, people, and places all the more meaningful and fun. My guest on this week's podcast is Max Allen. Max is a Melbourne-based multi-award-winning drinks writer and author of several excellent books, including Alternative Reality and Intoxicating 10 Drinks That Shaped Australia, both of which we discuss here, with more information available, as always, in the show notes. We also talked about sci-fi, synesthesia, and a bear called Rupert, fermented grape juice as a portal to understanding, Max's just two golden rules to live by, when there's more than froth and bubble to being a booze hack, how not starting with the end in mind takes you down riveting rabbit holes, swapping stories that beg a belief in pub snugs, the essence and ethics of journalism, embracing the gift of Indigenous history, and why showing Fred Crump in Wagga Wagga that you're having a good time is the way to save wine. I started by asking how young Max developed an appetite for adventure.
Little Max, gosh. I mean, I come from not too far from where you come from, I think. Where do you come from originally?
Rye in East Sussex.
Yeah, so I spent a lot of time in Brighton, in Sussex, from, 20? No, what am I talking about? 18 to 21 or so. But was born in Bristol, grew up in London, then moved to Brighton, then moved to Australia. So that's the order. But Little Max, Little Max. I mean, Little Max appears in my life story whenever I get the chance to tell it to people. I do remember, and this could be a memory of a photograph rather than an actual memory, but I have a very strong feeling of a memory of being in a high chair, stuffing my face with strawberry jam covered bread. And I do remember very strongly as a kid and then a teenager being inordinately interested in flavour. So in terms of how did I get here, I remember I obviously had no friends. I remember doing a tasting of lemonade. I'm I don't know, 13, 14, something like that, when everybody else was out smoking behind the bike sheds or worse. There I was, running around finding as many brands of lemonade as I could find and seeing for myself what they tasted like. Now, I mean, sounds like a convenient creation story for somebody who ended up, reviewing wine and writing about wine and drinks, but it's true. And I can't hide it. Somewhere in a bag or a box somewhere, there is actually, I wrote it up for myself as a little report, which is bizarre, really, when you think about it.
Yeah, I suppose also in literature there are always lots of evocations of those things that drive memories, often, things that spur stories going back into the past. The most famous one, I suppose, probably being Proust and his Madeleine. But was your interest in taste and the portal that taste and flavour could have also, do you think, bound up a little bit in the books that you read when you were young?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So I do have very strong, almost synesthetic. I don't think I'm synesthetic, but I think I'm kind of synesthetic adjacent. So as I'm sure everybody who listens to this very erudite podcast knows, synesthesia is the blending of the senses. So people who can see sound or touch colour. So when a synesthete smells the smell of roast chicken, they feel like they can touch the smell with their fingers. That's not true. They don't feel like they can. They do. They feel the sensation on their fingers of the smell of roast chicken. So I've always been fascinated by synesthesia because I do remember reading books. Rupert the Bear, Ed. Remember Rupert the Bear?
I remember Rupert very well.
Rupert the Bear. And Rupert the Bear was an illustrated cartoon that appeared like in the 1940s or something in the newspaper. And I used to get, every Christmas, I used to get a Rupert the Bear annual. So this is childhood, right? And for me, I can still remember I know you wanted a more literary reference, and I'll come to that. I remember every time Rupert the Bear ate or drank something, which was quite often, I could almost feel, I've had a sense that I could feel the sensation of the substance that was being consumed. Now, I obviously remember other sensations coming from those images and those stories, but I do remember the food and drink particularly. Yeah, the sense that flavour transports you is very, very early. And then when I was a bit older, reading books like, there's a science fiction author called Alfred Bester, and one of his key books from the 1950s, I think, is a book called The Stars, My Destination, otherwise known as Tiger Tiger. It's a kind of Count of Monte Cristo style. Somebody is exiled to the far reaches of the universe, or finds himself exiled to the far reaches of the universe, learns how to jump through space and time, and ends up wreaking revenge on the people that put him there. That's the very basic and probably wrong précis of that story. But he's a synesthete, and Alfred Bester was a synesthete. And the book is written with an attempt to capture that sense of synesthesia, the melding of the senses, in a literary sense. It's absolutely fascinating, famously unfilmable book, partly because of this synesthetic aspect. So that's another very strong memory of the sensation of flavour and the sensation of taste being more than just the sensation of taste and the sensation of flavour.
And I've heard you talking about traipsing around villages of Northamptonshire as a child. Again, those memories of delving into things, I suppose, I always picture you, and especially having read Intoxicating, where there's a few sort of dark nooks and crannies and cellars, and you can imagine the dust being blown off and the old smells, how they transport you to another time. Is that another thing from childhood that brings to mind, just going down rabbit holes as well from just foraging?
Yeah, literally. Talk to anybody who is really, really into pursuing whether it's wine or whiskey or food as a career, and you pretty soon find yourself, let's take wine. I think wine's the best example. If you're really into it, then describing what you're tasting to somebody else, or even to yourself, getting to grips with this invisible experience, like whether it's the smell of the wine or whether it's the taste of the wine in your mouth. All wine is the same. It's just fermented grape juice. And yet it is full of a universe of complexity, as you talk about, as we all know. And every time I come across people who say, but can you really taste the smell of your grandmother's handbag? Or can you really taste the smell of a roast dinner on a Sunday afternoon in that glass of whatever it is? And I say, yes, I can, because I'm kind of have spent the last 57 years now building up, consciously or not, building up a library of flavour references and memories that some wines literally have this immediate resonance with this memory. And the best thing I think anybody can do when they're going down, because it's never too late, when they're going down the wine rabbit hole, is pay attention to the world around them and lay down these flavour, taste, aroma memories, because they're your toolkit, building blocks, whichever metaphor you want to use, for being able to describe that ineffable, mysterious experience of drinking wine. So yes, when you're just talking about Northamptonshire, it's like I can smell the smell of the coal, because my grandparents, who I used to stay with a lot, had a coal burning fire, obviously, in Northamptonshire in the 70s. And all the coal will be delivered to the shed down the bottom of the garden. There was an outside toilet, so you had to go to the bottom of the garden, regardless of whether it was snowing or anything. And the smell of the coal in that shed and associated with the dampness of that experience absolutely brings back this incredibly strong memory for me. I don't think that's unusual. I think everybody is able to lay down these memories. It's whether you pay attention to them or not that is the difference.
And I think also paying attention, being conscious in tasting wine or anything like that, I mean, it really gives you a foothold into that moment as well. You're both accessing maybe something from the past, but you're giving something a little bit more traction in the present. And as you say, kind of taking it with you for the future too. Some people are perhaps more interested in that than others.
I don't ascribe necessarily to any kind of life mantras or anything, but I think a couple of really good rules for life are, one, don't be a dickhead, which kind of just covers so much. And the second one, which is even covered by even kind of the umbrella for don't be a dickhead, is pay attention. Pay attention is just like the best rule for life. Whether it is you're sitting down to a bowl of soup that you've just cooked, and by just paying attention for a little bit, you're increasing your enjoyment. I'm only saying that because I literally just did this before talking to you, as in had a bowl of soup. You're going to increase your enjoyment. If you cook the soup yourself, by paying attention, you're going to teach yourself how to do it better next time. By paying attention to the people you're having that soup with, you're showing, you know what I mean? Like paying attention, respect. Paying attention is just such a great rule, whether it's laying down flavour memories or anything really.
Yeah. My children are all now teenagers, 3 of them, but it's quite interesting to see how they flipped from thinking that things don't matter to them because they don't seem immediately relevant to paying a little bit more attention and seeing that perhaps they are. One of my big memories of that is how they didn't really understand how my wife and I used to listen to music in the car, listening to Triple R or PBS, and enjoy listening to music we'd never heard before. When you're a child, you really want to listen to the classics, put it on again and again and again. And it's interesting how some people are probably more open to taking in those new experiences all the time. This is one of the wonderful things about working in wine. You never know what's coming next or what it's going to do to you or who you are now compared to yesterday, last week or last year when you tasted that wine, because you've got new things to add to it.
Well, I mean, this is something I'm finding as I get older, is some of the smells, aromas that mean a lot to me from the past, and if I approach them again, I'll give you a good example. One of the first Penfolds wines that I got into, I don't know, when I was kind of a couple of years into really falling in love with wine in the UK in the 90s, early 90s, was Columna Bin 28. This isn't the ABC. We can mention as many brands as we want. I presume, is that right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And there was something about that one. I was 85 vintage was the first, and then the 86 that we went on to. So that's 6 years old or something by the time I got around to drinking it. And I remember the experience of drinking that wine now, 30 odd years later. And so I was at the Melbourne Film Festival the other night, and Penfolds had the sponsorship of the festival, and they had Bin 28 on by the plastic cup, not the glass. And so I tried it again, and I'm sure there are similarities because Penfolds is all about retaining house style, and I'm sure there are similarities between that wine and the wine from the 80s. But it obviously wasn't the same experience for me for all the reasons that we could name. I'm different, as you said, the context is different, the vintages are different, there is differences in winemaking and vineyard sourcing and all those things, but I still carry within me the memory of that wine back then that colours the wine that I was drinking 3 nights ago. And that time travel aspect, which you've picked up on from the beginning of this conversation, that time travel aspect of wine is one of the absolutely most fascinating things for me. And it will always be this eternal fascination that wine has the ability to transport you through time and space. Like Gully Foyle in The Star's My Destination, that's just occurred to me. Wow.
Yeah, quite. Actually, there was a moment when you were talking, I was listening to you, I've been listening to you most of the week actually, talking to Tim Atkin, I think, and you were talking about apples and how wonderful you thought it was that you could bite into an apple in the future and be tasting the same thing as someone in the past. Not quite the same as your Columna 28, but there is something there, isn't there, about how it connects you?
Well, that's an example of literally the same experience. So the experience that I had doing this is I bought during lockdown a crazy auction purchase of an old book of apple illustrations. You know, those botanical books from this one's from 1820, I think. And, illustrations of all the different varieties of apples that was put out by a nursery in West London, near where I grew up. And the daughter of the nursery owner illustrated these beautiful apples and hand-coloured them. So the page I'm looking at in front of me with this picture of a Devonshire Quarrendon apple was hand-painted by a woman in Brentford in 1820. And she probably had the apple in front of her. I did an apple tasting at Ripponlea Heritage Orchard, and we had some Devonshire Quarrendon apples that look exactly like this picture. And I gave these apples to people and said, now bite into that apple. If the woman who painted this apple 1820 picked up that apple and bit into it, it would taste exactly what you've got in your mouth right now because of the way apples are propagated. So, if you want a Devonshire Quarrendon apple tree, you have to take cuttings of the Devonshire Quarrendon tree and plant them, and the apples that grow on that tree are genetically identical, effectively, to the one that you took the cutting from. So if you keep doing that over generations, that's why a Cox's Orange Pippin apple or a Granny Smith is the same to you now, roughly, for the sake of the story, to when it was first bred by Anna Maria Smith in Sydney in 18, whatever it was. That's a different form of time travel. That's kind of bringing the past into the present, whereas some of those wine experiences we have can take us into the past, make us remember what we were doing in 1986 or what we were doing in 2005 when we first had that wine or when the wine was made.
Well, it's interesting you should mention Cox's Orange Pippins because they were the apple of Iden down the road from Rye where I grew up. And just mentioning that, I can just picture these blue and white boxes that we used to have. And when I say boxes, they were proper massive boxes with layers of apples that we used to just go through by the truckload when I was a kid. They were delicious apples, gotta say. While we're on apples, why don't we talk about your cider stuff? Because I don't know if you started with an end in mind with that, but I'm sure it's sort of also added to your appreciation of fermentation and natural processes, but also these other elements of sensory memory, etc.
I very often don't have an end in mind with most of what has become, the themes or the topics that I've followed or become known for over the years. So, and the cider is a case in point. The cider is something I didn't grow up with it. I was born in the West Country of England, so you could claim some kind of heritage there, but we moved away from Bristol when I was still a kid. So I have no cider memories actually relating to the West Country apart from later in life. But it's something I've always enjoyed drinking. Moving to Melbourne in the early 90s, cider was really just, the bottom of a popularity trough. And it was hard to find. And one of the only places I could find it happened to be out in the Yarra Valley at Kellybrook. And Kellybrook planted their first cider trees in the 60s and doggedly kept on making cider throughout its popular time in the 60s and 70s, and then kept making cider when it fell out of favour. And now it's obviously back in favour and has been for over a decade. So my writing about cider where I could was just pursuing my own interests. And then people started importing really good French cider from Normandy, so I wrote about that, and then started making my own in 2011, I think, and getting involved with the cider community that was just emerging at the time. And a little bit like the alternative varieties or biodynamics and winemaking, as a writer or as somebody who's curious about new developments in any field, it's a field, cider was, alternative varieties were, and biodynamics still is. It's a relatively small field. So it's one that you can become quite well versed in quite quickly. And that sounds kind of calculated, and it's not really, or maybe it is, but it means that you can become a specialist, which then possibly increases the possibility of people commissioning articles from you. That's not why I did it, but that is certainly an outcome. So if anybody, when biodynamics and natural wine were really picking up speed, particularly in Australia in the late 2000s, early 2010s, people were coming to me to commission articles because they knew that I was the person that was writing a lot about that kind of field, and alternative varieties is very much that, So the cider thing, I happened to kind of get really interested in that at the same time, or perhaps because of cider beginning to become a thing again in Australia from about 2010.
Now we've mentioned writing, we should probably speak a bit more about that. When did you first start writing?
What I had an aptitude for from as long as I can remember is art, is drawing, and less so painting. So that was kind of at school, secondary school, I was the art guy. At school, everybody has not everybody, but there are some people there's somebody who's like the sporty guy, or the maths whiz, or whatever, right? There's in a class or in a school, art was my thing, and performing and but also learnt that I had the ability to write and an interest in writing. And that continued through when I went to art school for 4 years. So I did visual arts, but I did a lot of creative writing as well, whether it's performance-based or poetry and things like that. So writing has always been, from my school years, part of my way of expressing myself and something I've been very interested in. But also, even like at art school, one of the pieces I did, which was a one-person performance spoken word piece, was about Northamptonshire and about layers of history.
Right.
Because the town that my grandparents lived in, there was a lot of 19th century industrial factories. Both my grandparents worked in factories. My grandfather worked in a shoe factory. There was a shoe factory across the road from their terraced house. And then below that, there was Norman and Roman history. So the landscape that I was walking through as a kid, I was conscious of these layers of history. So that was something that I wrote about and did a performance about. I'm just making these connections literally as we speak. And so then left art school, fell in love with wine. Wine became the major obsession, worked for a bottle shop, moved to Australia. And before I did that, I worked with Robert Joseph and people like Tim Atkin and Oz Clarke on a wine competition. And Robert said, who was then one of the editors at the Wine magazine, if you're out in Australia and you come across any stories, let us know, we'd be interested in. So that was what planted the seed, really. And then moved to Melbourne in 92 when everything was just beginning to kick off with hospitality changes in Melbourne in that time. People who you know very well, like Patrick Walsh, was a waiter at Walter's Wine Bar in Southgate. It was a really, really great time to arrive in Melbourne. There was a lot of a sense of a culture being formed in front of our eyes. And so I was literally at the right place at the right time and sent off stories and they got published. That's how that worked.
Well, Patrick actually was my guest on episode 4. He was talking about Walters and also talking about the theatre scene and art scene and just general vibrancy of the time. So I guess an ex-art student arrived from the UK into wine, into writing, probably all sorts of your element, wasn't it? What
am I going to do? Did I have a choice? I mean, yes, I had a choice. I actually tried a lot of different things and this is the one that stuck. So I worked in retail. I worked in, never worked in hospitality, as in restaurants on the floor, but did a lot of retail and did a bit of label design, a bit of consulting. And because The Age published a story, that's the kind of direction. And Divine Magazine, of course, which was a long running, I went for about 20 years, I think, from memory. It had just launched its first issue. So a guy called Andrew Wood, I was talking about this to somebody in a wine shop yesterday and they had no idea of its existence. But Divine Magazine was a food and wine magazine, self-published in Melbourne in the early 90s that really helped a lot of people like me. And Andrew deserves credit for supporting those writers and supporting that scene, being very supportive of the specialist cheesemakers who were emerging at the time, that kind of thing. So I think we were the first to write about people like Bindi and a lot of other new and emerging producers back then. I mean, it's impossible to even imagine now that people like Bindi were new and emerging. They feel like they've been there forever, but they were. It was a great time. Still is a great time.
Yeah. Well, speaking of timeless classics, your first story for The Age, I believe, was on Yeringberg, which is a very Max Allen subject. I think everyone would say it's the kind of place that has all the evocations of history and a huge amount of groundedness to its existence there in the Yarra Valley. What was it about that story then that drew you to it and continues to, because you've revisited it a few times?
So one of the first jobs I got when I moved out here from England was cellar door at Coldstream Hills. And I used to go out on the train to Lilydale with my bike. And I used to get on my bike. This was when I was much younger and much fitter. And well, not much fitter, but certainly a lot younger. And cycle from Lilydale Station all the way up to Coldstream Hills. And I used to cycle past the Yeringberg Hill, whether it was on the Maroondah Highway or the other way behind, and became aware of this incredible historic vineyard on the hill that didn't open to visitors. Went up there for the open weekends. Just anybody who's been there knows that it's just the history just embraces you. It's just unbelievable. And felt that it was bizarre that Melbourne, here I was, I'd just arrived in Melbourne less than a year ago and year before, and here was this place that everybody I felt should know about. I also went to a wine media conference a couple of years ago. Oh, actually, it was before COVID. So yeah, a few years ago. And one of the speakers there said the essence of journalism is, I know something you don't know, let me tell you about it. And that was my impulse, I realise now, with the Ehrenberg thing. Yes, it was a historical story, but it might not have been historical. But there was something about that story that was like, why doesn't everybody know about this? I'm going to tell you. Now, of course, they did, but I didn't realise at the time. And they certainly were less public-facing than the family are now. And that was really the motivation for that. And that obviously captured the Rita Ehrlich, the editor's imaginations, because she published it, and the rest, as they say. What I find interesting looking back on that story is I didn't touch on the Indigenous connections that the Dupuy family of Ehrenberg had and have, which is also a reflection of where a lot of us were at in the early 90s, right? Mm-hmm. More shamefully, then did a book in 1999 on the Yarra Valley, which again didn't really, if at all, from memory, touch on the Indigenous history of the region, and that is less excusable because, and that possibly a motivation for trying, partly a motivation for making sure that I share what I've learned since then about the Indigenous history of the Yarra Valley, and particularly Corrindurk, and the relationship with the Dupuy family and the people of Corrindurk since then. Because I can't believe, looking back as recently as 1990, it doesn't sound like a long time ago to me, I know, but it's 26 years, that you wouldn't conceive of writing a book about a wine region now without mentioning its Indigenous history. I don't think. I like to think, I hope, nobody would. But back then in the early 90s, it was something you could do without even blinking. That's probably, it's just really interesting to look back on that now.
Yeah, but also, playing devil's advocate for you, I mean, that was the world that you were stepping into as well. You were someone from somewhere else, not really landing in a story where that context was really paid any heed at all, let alone given its due. To that point, you have actually managed to rectify that to some degree by telling the Corrindurk story in a few different media as well. Like, you've managed to engage with a few different audiences, not just through wine with that story, which again, I suppose, goes to show the value of not wine itself, but of looking at the context around it. I mean, a good story to share.
Oh, it's a great story to share. And if anybody isn't familiar with it, who's listening, it's relatively easy to find a lot of information about Corrindurk, about William Barak, about the relationship between Barak and the Dupuy family that has gone online and been published elsewhere since 2013 or 14, when I got a State Library fellowship to write about that relationship. Why I think it's such a great story for the wine industry or wine people, anybody interested in wine, is the picture that Barak did of one of the Dupuy's vineyards. So Barak did a number of now highly sought after images late in his life in the late 19th century. So he was a traditional man. He was born before the colonisation of Victoria in the 1830s. So he saw the disruption firsthand that occurred during his lifetime, and yet at the end of his life still had the generosity of spirit to create this image of a vineyard, which is the only image that anybody's aware of that isn't just of traditional pre-contact, pre-invasion life. And it's a picture that has a little dedication at the bottom of it to one of the Dupuy family. And it's this, as one of Barak's descendants, Alan Wandon, said when he read it, it's a very affectionate dedication that Barak wrote on the bottom of this picture. And that kind of, in itself, upsets perhaps our preconceptions about black and white relations in the 19th century. There's a humanity to it, and there's a depth of emotion to that story and that image that I find just really compelling and really profound, and has totally shaped my perception of who I am as an Englishman living in Australia, living on Wurundjeri country in a very deep way. What I also love about that story is talking to Auntie Joy Wandon, who again is a Barak descendant, and her perception of that image, her reading of that image which features a vineyard in the middle surrounded by gum trees in this hollow of a hill, is that she reads it as the country is providing or is supporting or welcoming both the trees that were there already and the vineyard in the middle. And that feels like a gift to people living on the land and growing wine today. That concept feels like a gift. So that's why I'm so keen to spread the message of that story, and why it was so great to see that used on the cover of Andrew Caillard's book. That image is used on the cover of the first volume of the Australian Arc, which deals with the early history of wine growing in Australia.
Yeah, speaking of gifts, there is certainly a long way to go, I think, giving a little bit more, you use the word profound, but certainly a lot more depth and genuineness to the Indigenous story. I mean, it's actually a gift waiting to be accepted, that there is such a rich history that hasn't been really properly acknowledged in anything but a tokenistic way that people can be part of. And I thought the story of your Waialina discovery in Tasmania was also, a fantastic way of delving back there. Just tell us a little bit about how you came across that story.
You mentioned it before. What was the end point? When you start a project, or when you go down a rabbit hole, or you wander down a new path of inquiry, not having an end in sight, it can often take you to places that you didn't expect. So this is how a lot of the best stories happen, is with these unforeseen connections. That it's slightly off topic, but algorithms can't take you there. If you have this open-ended, many path view of how you approach life, the roads connect in unexpected ways. Cider took me to Tasmania, to an orchard established by a guy called Clive Crossley, and he planted a lot of amazing old European cider trees and pear trees on the banks of the D'Entrecasteaux Channel south of Hobart, which was in itself a great thing to experience and taste through all these apples in the orchard. And in the middle of this orchard was this big gum tree. And he said, that's a cider gum. He planted it because it's called a cider gum. And he said it comes from the Central Highlands of Tasmania. This is 15 years ago or more. And it comes from the Central Highlands of Tasmania. I've heard that Aboriginal people used to use the sap to make drinks, but I've never got any sap coming out of the tree. That lodged in the back of my mind. And then I came across Maggie Brady, who's a researcher at the ANU, or was a researcher at the ANU. And she had written and worked a lot with Aboriginal communities. She'd written a lot about alcohol in Aboriginal communities. And one of the things she put out in 2008, I think, it was like a book of educational resources looking at alcohol and First Nations people in Australia. And she started at the beginning, which was historical instances of drinks being produced around Australia, from Queensland to WA, from the Northern Territory down to Tasmania, fermented alcoholic drinks. And one of them was this drink, Waialina, produced from the sap of the cider gum. So this is years after I'd spoken to Clive, and this connection was made. Then I thought, I have to look into this and learn more about it. So I did some research and found a few instances, and then was talking to a baker who went down to Tasmania looking for wild yeasts, and he brought back some of this sap, and it had fermented, and we tasted it. And I just kept thinking about all these things, and then read Dark Emu by Bruce Pascoe, and that really changed the way I think about Australia. And then made more of an effort to find out about Waialina, and then realised that at that time there were a number of Australian producers using Indigenous ingredients in gin, so this is the mid-2010s, and other drinks, and realised that I had the bookends to a history of drinking in Australia, with pre-invasion drinks and modern Indigenous ingredient drinks, and all I had to do was fill in the middle. So the Waialina, the cider gum, I had to go there. I just realised that the book needed to start with me, or the reader, in front of one of those trees, tasting the drink on country as a literary acknowledgement. That was the perfect start to the book. So I managed to go with a bunch of researchers from Adelaide Uni who were looking into Indigenous yeasts, and they had made contact with the Tasmanian Aboriginal Corporation, who owned a tract of that land with some cider gum trees on it, and we managed to go there, and it was proper field work, Ed. It was proper, sleeping rough in a shack with no electricity, no running water, drinking out of the creek, leeches.
Ooh.
It was proper.
You suffer for your art.
I do, but it was amazing, and yeah, I really wanted to feel that. I wanted the experience of what this tasted like. So the motivation for intoxicating was always using flavour as a portal into the past or through space, but also as a portal into understanding. The only way I could possibly do that was actually to travel to taste it for myself. It was really incredible.
Yeah, well, we may get to cover off some other parts of that book, but in case we don't, it is fantastic. And also, none of those portals, none of those ways of opening up stories is remotely contrived. And that's really the whole point. I mean, that's why I love that book so much. You can really see so many different ways that things can end up, but really interesting how they end up, where they end up. Well, not end up, actually, where they get to, because obviously it's still evolving forward. But that's very, very highly recommended reading. Another thing about your stories that I'm sure that you've enjoyed is covering them with other people. And you've had a long-standing collaborator, I should say, not famous to me because he lives down the road and I play tennis with him, but Adrian Lander, very talented photographer. It really strikes me, especially in this day and age, that the luxury of having someone lend colour and texture to these stories. I mean, it's such an important part of storytelling, even as a writer, to have those angles, that colour, those extra pieces. It's an enormous thing, I suppose, for a reader or a listener or a viewer to miss out on when we don't have that. Yeringberg is one of those things. I mean, it won an award, a very prestigious award for that film. But what does it mean to you to be able to go and cover these stories with other people that you trust and respect and that probably give you a little bit of extra insight into your own learning?
Oh, it's been great. I mean, Adi and I have been working together since Red and White. Well, slightly before that, but the first book that we did was Red and White, which was 97. And Red and White was co-authored, so we shared the royalties on that. So partly because it was a way for the publisher at the time to justify not giving Adi the budget he needed to shoot his beautiful photographs, so he was going to share the profits, then offset that, because it is a very, very photographically intensive book, and it was probably the most collaborative thing in that very often so there are examples, I can't remember which chapter it was, but he was shooting something, I think it was a young vine. There's a picture of a young vine coming up out of a grow guard, shot from below to make it look like this big triffid coming into the sunshine. I think there's some water coming down on it, something like that. I think it was one of those images. And as he was shooting it, the images that I was seeing, Polaroids, because this is pre-digital, I was literally, I think I had a laptop open on the top of a barrel or a notebook, and I changed what I was writing based on the images that he was shooting. So, I mean, that is pure collaboration, right? So it's not like in most cases the text is written, the photographer is commissioned, or more likely the photographs are sourced post-fact. So that level of collaboration does feel like a bit of an indulgence now in today's media landscape, but it's not gone entirely. So the most recent collaboration we have had in that respect is working on a story about Balgownie Estate. The original one, which has been sold just outside Bendigo, has been sold to property developers and looks like being flattened and turned into houses, which I felt was in itself is a story worth covering. But the fact that just before it was closed, Stuart Anderson, the 93-year-old, amazingly influential veteran winemaker who had such an impact on the Victorian wine scene since the 70s, he and Michael Dillon, his protege, Michael had the idea to go back with Stuart to pick a couple of tons of Cabernet and a couple of tons of Chardonnay off the original 1960s and 70s vines. They'd already had that plan, then the sale went through. So you've got this layer of poignancy upon poignancy. And I thought that would make a great story to cover. So I felt that was really important that Adi and I both went up during harvest and shot a lot of imagery, which was used in the feature that I wrote for the Financial Review magazine about that story. But we also shot video and are shooting more video, so that hopefully will turn into a short film, because I think the story it's not really a story about a vineyard. it is a story about a vineyard, because anybody who's been lucky enough to have those old Balgownie Cabernets from the 80s, for example, the 81, the 80, the 79, the Shirazes is from that era too, and the blends will know that that vineyard has within it the potential to make great wine. And throughout the ownership changes over the years, hasn't always been realised, but it's clearly a great, great vineyard. And they're not that common, those vineyards that produce wines that are still not just great old wines, but like great wines full stop after 40 years in the bottle. But then there's this relationship between Stuart and Michael, right? And there's a theme here as well. You know, a lot of the story of Yeringberg is a relationship of father-son legacy. And so that's possibly why I'm so interested in this connection. I've had some fabulous conversations with both Stuart and Michael through this process. Mind-blowing in that Stuart was about in his late 50s when he started working at Bindi and advising Bill Dillon and Michael in the early days of Bindi. And he's the same age that Michael Dillon is now. And I pointed out that Michael kind of is, whether he likes it or not, has that same kind of mentor role in the wine community, and particularly in Victoria. You know, and that he was like, oh my God, it's so true. Like that's you know, really one of the things as you get older, you realize that you're the same age as somebody who meant a lot to you early on in your life. So working with AD on that has been great, and I don't know where that's heading. You know, hopefully, as I say, we'll manage to shoot enough. The other great thing about that story, it's slightly off topic, is Stuart's nephew is also a photographer, Tim Griffith, a well-known architectural photographer.
Yeah.
And so he also shot a lot of stuff. So without even, you know, realizing I've got two cinematographers working on this. So we have to do something, really.
Yeah, that's fantastic to know that there might be more to come on that and some video. It's for so many reasons, a really important story, but a lot of emotion comes across in those pictures. And as you say, that relationship as well. And it's interesting too, talking about Bindi as an up-and-comer all those years ago. There's another thing going on entirely in that story there. It feels like there is a little bit of an inflection point at the moment. I know that it's always easy to say that you're in the middle of an important part of history, but there's a real reckoning going on generally. But there's also, it feels like, a rather precarious point of things potentially getting lost. And I feel like the Balgownie vineyard is a little bit of a metaphor for something a bit bigger, those links to the past. There's been a little bit of a backlash against certain things that potentially risk not realizing what we lose when we don't appreciate where we've come from in that regard. Do you see anything there that we can pay a little bit more heed to in hopefully making sure that we're keeping a really important bridge between the past of Australian wine and the future? Because it could be and should be, and I hope it will be, a bright future.
What backlash? What do you mean a backlash?
Perhaps a certain sense that the way that we do things now, we're more informed, shines a light on the past sometimes that looks ignorant, insensitive, unbalanced. That a little bit of that cringe, I suppose, at how a history that wasn't as inclusive, fair, progressive clouds the past perhaps, and our willingness to draw from it the things that were actually valuable and the things that were perhaps innocent too.
I think it's really important to record and make available the richness of the history for future generations. And I think since that Yeringberg story in 1993 for The Age, that same motivation is very much at the heart of a lot of what I do, you know, interviewing the old blokes before they die, and they're mostly blokes. At the moment, they're mostly blokes. Give them another 30 years and there'll be much more diversity of people to speak to when you're talking about the old generation. I think it's hugely important. It's the foundation. You know, any metaphor you want to choose about developing a rich culture in any field, whether it's food, drink, music, having that rich understanding of who came before you is fundamental, I think, to a sense of identity, to the authenticity, integrity, any of those words you want to use. You need to know where you come from to be able to go anywhere in the future. I feel increasingly that's important, which is why this Balgownie story is something I'm really passionate about, and why the Yeringberg story was something I'm really passionate about.
Just to clarify that point, actually, when the world becomes more inclusive, as it absolutely should, some of those excluded from the past sometimes don't necessarily see, because they weren't part of it or it wasn't part of them, that it is part of their future or their line through, I suppose, and then who bridges that gap?
That's very interesting. So my limited experience of working closely with or having a close connection with a much younger and more diverse group of wine interested people comes when every year I do a week's intensive teaching at Melbourne Uni, and it's kind of a general introduction to the classic wines of France and how those wines have influenced the rest of the wine world, right? And that's an incredibly diverse group of people that we get on that course. And what I find is how fascinated and engaged those very diverse 20-year-olds, to generalize, how fascinated and engaged they are in what you could describe as, the old white men of the wine world. Partly because I think there's a very strong understanding that was then, and this is very much now. I mean, that's the whole point, really. If you look at the history of Burgundy, Champagne, and Bordeaux, for example, it's the history of empire, it's the history of global trade, it's the history of the transition from feudal to industrial, all those really big theme historical stories that also happen to have something that you can put in your mouth and it tastes nice. I'm not finding a lot of negative reaction to that. And when there is not negative reaction, when there is some kind of criticism of, for example, the role of wine in the colonisation of countries like Australia and South Africa and New Zealand, wine growing being used as part of the colonial project to instill some sense of comfortable order on a savage and wild landscape, all those themes that are fascinating area of research at the moment, that is also engaged with very strongly.
On another note on history, I know that you've reckoned with this, and I think COVID was probably a time when you did. The idea that being a booze writer sounds frivolous. That what does it matter when the world's going to hell in a handbasket, that I'm sitting down enjoying this arcane beverage and thinking about writing a story about it? How does it sit with you?
Well, that was a very specific conversation I had with an editor during that time when, and I think it was pretty early on. I think it was like, I don't know, it would be maybe June 2020. So we were a couple of months into the worst of it, or what felt like the worst of it. And yes, I did have that conversation. It's like, it just feels. And it was almost a distilled version of a question that I'm constantly asking, which is really, in the grand scheme of things, writing about the latest single vineyard Pinot Noir really doesn't feel like it's very important or contributing to the grand sum of knowledge or experience of humanity or engaging with the really big ideas. But the editor said to me, yes, but at the same time, the experience that people are going through right now around the world, in the more affluent westernized societies at least, is everybody sitting at home drinking wine. And your stories are a reflection, a record of that experience. And so therefore, you have a role to play. I had a similar feeling around, about 20 years ago. I have the feeling quite a lot, but I had it particularly badly about 20 years ago for some reason. I can't remember why, and bumped into Don Levy Fitzpatrick. And Don Fitzpatrick may be familiar to some people listening as the guy behind the George Hotel and Melbourne Wine Room in St Kilda, which was such a breeding ground for talent that's gone on to bigger and greater things. People like Karen Martini. So many people came out of that breeding ground. It was just a really important Melbourne gastronomic institution. And I bumped into him at a winery in Geelong, and we had lunch. And I said I was feeling this kind of sense of, well, why am I just, it's a frivolous thing to do. And not only did he reiterate that idea that really, whether you're writing about wine or operating on somebody's heart or playing clarinet at the symphony or kicking a football, you owe it to yourself and everybody else to do the best you can at what you're doing at the time. Paying attention comes back to paying attention. And also that, yes, I might just be writing about wine, but I'm also writing about people's life's work and those people who are making a living from farming the land and supporting communities and all those things. I'm part of that group of people that ensures that can continue. And so both of those things really just, as I say, reiterated that it's not just about the wine in the glass. I'm not just writing about the wine in the glass, and never have really, which is why, if don't tell anybody this, but if I never have to write another tasting note, I'm quite happy. But it's part of the job. So, so all you can do there is do the best you can and make them at least entertaining. I mean, it's what was in the glass. It's the flavour that got me there in the first place, but it's everything that's behind the glass that's really the most important thing to write about, I think.
Yeah. It's also a reflection of something that people do because they believe in it. They do it perhaps because it gives other people pleasure. And other people are obviously part of, inevitably, your experience as well. We talked about collaborating with Adrian Lander on stories, talked about your observation of other people's relationships in those stories and those really fascinating father-son, mentor-protege stories, all kinds of other connections there. Swapping stories is a huge part of what it's all about. Something that I think cannot be overemphasized when we're talking about modern life and potential loneliness. But speaking of swapping stories, the neighborhood bar kind of idea as well is a really important thing, I feel, to you. I know that it's a long time since you've been in England, but you do still remind me quite a lot of someone who would be just going from snug to snug, just having chats. And Gerald's Bar is obviously one of your favourite little snugs to go to. You obviously had quite a lot of fun editing Gerald's book.
Yeah, Beggar's Belief, which was... I was going through old notes the other day and realised that Gerald and I have been talking about that for a very long time. So Gerald Diffie runs Gerald's Bar in North Carlton, coming up to 20 years, I think, about to move to larger premises. And Gerald was one of the first people I wrote about for The Age back in 95, from memory, who was then running the Kent Hotel in Rathdown Street, just a few doors down from where Gerald's Bar is now. And what I love about Gerald's is, you're right, and what I love about every great little bar that I go to, whether it's a whiskey bar in Tokyo or a pub in Sussex or a wine bar in Melbourne somewhere, is that's the place where you feel at home, right? And so what Gerald tried to do with Gerald's Bar was to fill it with knickknacks from his past, and just so you feel like you're walking into his brain almost. And that's what we tried to do. Editing, that was a lockdown project, editing. So what Gerald did is literally wrote all his stories, and a lot of them are on the printed page, maybe 1 or 2 pages. But he wrote them all in longhand in exercise books and, foolscap pads. And he gave them to me one day in shopping bags full of all these longhand bags and said, "Can you make a book out of that?" And I'm like, oh my God. Luckily, some of them had already been transcribed. But I did most of the transcribing during lockdown because I had the time by using transcription software. Gerald has a natural ability to write like he speaks, and that's a very difficult thing to do. On the page, it didn't always, like the punctuation wasn't always in the right place, and the lines, you and I might separate paragraphs and things like that. But on the page, but effectively the story is all there, just like he speaks. And so I read them out into some transcription software rather than try and physically type, looking up the page and physically type them. And the transcription software was good enough to spit out pretty much 100% transcribed that captured the spirit of his speech patterns. I printed them all out on small bits of paper, laid them out on a large desk, and shuffled them around until I visually had what felt like the right order, a narrative flow to the piece, like a storyboard, if you like, for a film. I knew that the first story had to be the first story, the one about him at a party getting covered with a bowl of custard. I knew the story about him going back to see his dad had to be the last story, and just shuffled them around until I had a nice feel. Again, that's an indulgence, that's a luxury. You don't get very often to have the time to do that, but that's how I put that book together. I mean, that bar is all about relationships and storytelling and unexpected connections. My favourite bar in the world, my favourite pub in the world, is somewhere we went in Berkshire, I think it was, after a tramp through the snow. And we walked into this little pub that had one of those low ceilings, like looks like you've got behind you there. And there was a picture on the wall of at one time when a pony had walked into the bar and was standing at the bar looking like it was drinking, one of those pubs. Black Swan, I think it was called. So yes, I'm absolutely a huge fan of that kind of environment.
You did a little bit of a speaking tour with that, and you've also done quite a few things, I think, with Richard Cornish, some other presentations that are a little bit outside of the remit of a wine critic type writer. It's really lovely to get feedback on what you write and to know that it's resonating with people, but also to have people interact with those ideas and for them to come back to you. Do you get a lot of that? Are people happy to talk to you and happy to let you know what they have taken away from your stories?
Apparently people are very intimidated by me, and I can't imagine why this is. Apparently my resting bitch face is just like, don't talk to me. And it's probably not. It's probably I'm thinking about something else, and I'm as charming as anything once you know, but apparently I'm intimidating. So those people who do have the guts to approach me and say whatever it is, good on them for bravery. One of the best things any writer can have happen to them is somebody coming up to you and saying your work changed my life. I'm not saying this happens a lot and changed my life in not particularly profound ways, but I have had people come up to me. This happened in the last couple of months where somebody in their 50s came up to me and said, your book Red and White, which I read 25 years ago, is why I'm here at this wine event and one of the reasons why I made wine my career, right? Through teaching, I get this, and it's the same impulses, same communication. Here's something I know. I want to share my information with you. I've had students in the last 5 years who have been doing a degree in history or whatever, and are now running wine shops or studying for their WSET. Or so to have that effect on people. I've had people, plant varieties in their vineyards because they've read what I've written, or it's contributed to that decision. So yes, to know that you have had an impact even on half a dozen people through your work is incredibly rewarding. And I'm really not that intimidating.
Oh, I would have thought you'd have a rather cuddly avuncular demeanour to you.
The amount of effort I have to take to do that right now.
But I was laughing the other day. Anita Good from Wangalina was telling me that she went to a wine dinner or an event that you were doing, and she was with someone she knew, and she said, "Oh, you're so lucky you're sitting next to Max Allen." And he said, "Yeah? Who's he?"
Well, this is one of the advantages about being quite grumpy and reclusive, is that the new generation of people in wine have no idea who I am, which is fantastic. It means I can go to cellar doors or restaurants and not get that kind of awkward, thing that has happened in the past and really shouldn't happen.
I've got another book in my hand here, The Future Makers. Very before its time, and yet time has bloody flown since that was written. But one of the things that obviously strikes me is the inevitability that being interested in other people's stories and not being a dickhead and paying attention has obviously made you friends with quite a lot of people. Belonging to an industry that can be so incredibly welcoming and friendly and warm and stimulating, really, in terms of its social aspect and what you learn from other people. How do you sort of feel that you balance that belonging and being apart from the subject, your solitary and social side?
It's not just the solitary and social. It's, unfortunately, I get wrapped up in old-fashioned ideas of ethics and how you should behave. So I don't think, and this is probably going to come back to bite me on the bum if it hasn't already, I don't think if you're reporting on an industry that you should be socializing too closely with those same people. And it's a really tricky thing. And I know that a lot of people are happy to navigate that, or much better at navigating that than I feel like I have been. I feel like I could have made a lot closer friends over the years than I have. So I probably, how many cliches do you want to bring out here? Cutting off my nose to spite my face. I've also been in the position where I've wanted to, or felt the need to write about something that vaguely resembles news as opposed to opinion, which is most of what I do. I'm in this beautiful vineyard, I'm trying these gorgeous wines, I think you should try this too, is not news, right? It's a reporting, but it's not news. As in, so-and-so has been bottling something and telling you it's one thing when in fact it's another. That's news. And that I've written those kind of stories for the actual paper, not just the wine column up the back in the past, and always felt that if that comes up again, I really just can't cope with being too close to the people involved if that were going to be a news story, right? And I have felt in some cases that I have got too close, and I always upset people when I say this. I've actually said to some winemakers in the past, like, I'm not that I'm not your friend, but I'm kind of not your friend, because I can't really afford to be your friend if you do something that I need to tell people about. And this is probably wrong. I don't know. I actually tie myself up in knots about this a lot. I feel like I got too close to a lot of the people who were involved in the natural wine rootstock generation movement of about 12, 13 years ago. One in particular, Sam Hughes, who took his own life. And that really still upsets me a lot because I felt like he was somebody I was becoming quite close to. I felt that was okay because he was coming from outside the industry. He was not a winemaker. He hadn't come up through winemaking. He was more approaching wine as an art project. That resonated with me, no surprise. And he had a way of expressing and communicating what he was trying to do that was unique. And I got very close to him on a number of levels, and that really, really cut me up, as it did a lot of people. So I've had, and it's very long-winded and rambling, but that's kind of a reflection of how I feel about this. And again, I'm probably going to upset people, but it's just something I've felt that I had to take a bit of an ethical stand on. But at the same time, probably now that I'm older, I can probably relax that a bit. But I don't know, Ed, to be honest.
Yeah, I mean, it's tricky. I mean, it's complicated massively by what your role is. And unfortunately, your role is in a slightly grey area there.
It's in a very grey area, but it's also self-appointed, right? This is it's nobody making these decisions apart from me about how I should be behaving. Like, the editors aren't doing it. As far as the editors are concerned, as long as I disclose any conflicts of interest or any potential or any kind of, so in today's paper, the writer travelled to Stillwater in Launceston in Tasmania as a guest of Stillwater, right? As long as that kind of transparency is there, that's all they care about, as they should. And so should the reader, I think. But and it is such a greyer area than it was arguably when I started 30 years ago, because there are so many boundaries being crossed between commercial and editorial that you almost want to give up and just say.
And also complicated massively by the fact, and this is an unspoken thing, I think, that there's a huge power dynamic in place when there is a commentator and someone with a commercial interest.
Yeah, and it's tricky because, I'm arguably breaking my own rules constantly by getting so closely involved with the cider industry, with the alternative varieties movement. Absolutely hold my hand up and declare myself as a participant, not an observer, in that I wanted to support that impulse in Australia, but not necessarily for direct commercial gain. I don't have a vineyard. I don't have a wine brand. All I'm doing it for is because I think it will make the world a better place. And, I'm really proud of all the changes that's happened to Australian wine culture as a result of the Alternative Varieties Wine Show. And that, you've spoken about this so eloquently in the past, and it is such, unless people have experienced it, it sounds like a cliche. The family and the community that is around that event that happens every year in Mildura has been profoundly important to shaping Australian culture, not just wine culture. I'm on that side of the fence, but absolutely declare myself on that side of the fence at all times. It's obvious.
Yes.
There's no grey area there.
On that front, I've got a copy of Alternative Reality in my hands because I wanted to read what I thought was just such a beautiful sentiment from this book. And I'm sorry, Max, it's not from you. It's Stefano De Pieri's forward in here, where he says, "Nothing comes from nothing." That line has stuck with me and seemed appropriate when I was thinking about what to write in this preface. It occurred to me that the Alternative Varieties Wine Show may seem like a fluke, the serendipitous coming together of various individuals who were simply at the right place at the right time and had enough intuition to understand the opportunity. But perhaps history itself has the biggest say. After all, historical processes have a certain inevitability given the right conditions. I love everything about that idea, and I also think it goes to the heart of the Alternative Varieties Wine Show, but also really to the heart of stories, of connections, of following your intuition, following your curiosity and paying attention. It seems to really wrap up a lot about the possibilities that have driven you to constantly find your work interesting and people interesting and your field interesting.
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, as it should, this conversation has helped kind of, this is just going to sound like both of us patting each other on the back, unfortunately, but that's just the way it is, has helped a few ideas coalesce in my mind about these connections myself. So I think you're right. I think that's the way to go. Not have a predetermined goal, but set out with the expectation or being prepared to go down all sorts of avenues. And when those paths cross, paying attention enough to know what to do with it. That's right. I think that absolutely sums up the way I've approached things. And it seems to have worked all right.
Yeah, I'd say so. And obviously I sent you a rambling bunch of bullet points, which did include a few things that you might call topical. And I'm very aware that some of them seem negative. And I'm really interested in the flip side of those things, the positive. And I think that that's clearly possible to have a conversation that thinks more about what you can do rather than what you can not dwell on. Obviously, it covered things that, we are in and around wine shows, scoring, the way that wine is presented to the general public and the general public's engagement or lack thereof in wine. I don't want to talk about any of those negative things because I feel like we've talked about the light side, I think.
But can I just interrupt though?
Yeah.
Because I wonder whether, I have this conversation a lot with people within the wine industry, and I use that word specifically. So people who are producing, selling, marketing wine. And they talk about the negative a lot. Nobody's buying Shiraz anymore. Young people don't engage with what we're doing. You've heard all these things about the industry's never been so tough. Like, it's so hard to make $1. There's no profits. That's not what it looks like from the outside. I think from people who are not involved in the production, selling, communication, it's never been so exciting. There's unbelievable choice on the shelves. There's new bars opening literally every day, full of great bottles. Yeah, they're a bit too expensive, but not always. Being served by friendly, knowledgeable people in a spirit of conviviality and hospitality. Things look great with wine. Don't beat yourself up. I'm not saying for a moment that everything's hunky-dory. It really isn't. We know that. It's worse than people are saying.
Yeah.
I think structurally, this isn't just wine, structurally things are worse than we pretend they are. But to the people that really matter, the people who are buying and drinking the wine and enjoying it with each other, there's a lot to love. And young people are drinking wine. Don't get in their way. Yeah. Stop trying to appeal to the young people. They're doing a pretty good job of it themselves, I reckon. Apart from the ones that aren't drinking, but we don't need to talk about them.
Well, I was going to say, the flip side of it's not all hunky-dory isn't necessarily it's all rosy. It's just there is so much to talk about. And really, if that's what got you into it and what's kept you into it and surrounded you by people who are entirely inspiring and who have taught you so much, and that I feel the same thing, means that there is so much for other people to learn. And that is potentially the culture. It's probably what you shine the light on, I think.
I think the best thing that people in wine can do to communicate their story to the outside world, to connect with them, is to tell the stories of the joy that it gives them, whether it's pruning or parties or whatever it is. Talking about looking at the relatively recent wine past in Australia and thinking about things differently. Len Evans, the great spruiker of Australian wine, who died almost 20 years ago, something he said really sticks with me. Back in the 60s, when Len Evans started writing about wine consumption in Australia was nowhere near as high as it is today. And the narrative is that Len's writing in places like the Bulletin, but he was on TV, he was all over the place, helped change the culture and helped more people drink wine. And Len's anecdote that he told me a few months before he died in an interview I did, but he's told it many times before, is when he started writing about wine, he got a letter from somebody. I think he called him Fred Crump in Wagga Wagga or something. And he said, "Dear Mr. Evans, when I started reading what you and your wine friends get up to, we used to drink beer every time we get together on a Friday night with everybody in the street. And now we all bring bottles of wine because we read about your life in wine and it sounded like so much fun that we thought we'd give it a go." And I think that it sounds simplistic, but it kind of sums up, obviously, address the fundamental structural underlying issues that are plaguing the industry and the society. But if you want to get people excited about what you're doing, tell them about how exciting it is. This is the way Australian wine should be promoted around the world, by the way. I've always said this too, is that all we need to do is have fun here and let people know that you're having fun, so they look at you from the other side of the world and go, what's going on over there? They're having a good time. All they're hearing now is things terrible. Oh, are they? Well, why should we buy Australian wine then if everything's terrible?
Yeah.
It's a really, really difficult thing to get the balance right, because you don't want to just be a booster. You don't want to just gloss over things and say everything's fine, as we just said. Like, I know, everybody who's involved in wine at any kind of more than casual level knows, as soon as wine passionate people get together, like, there are these connections and stories and things happen, and like so much great stuff. It's hard though, isn't it? It's really hard.
That's it for this week's podcast. If you paid attention and are glad that you did, please like it, subscribe, tell everyone, give it a rating. It really helps. You can also subscribe to my Substack. That's edmerison.substack.com. Feel free to leave a comment. Let me know what you'd like to hear more of. But for now, I'd like to say thank you to Lucas James for the music, Neil Williams for the artwork, Elizabeth Clancy for the edit, and to my guest, Max Allen. Till next time, live wine to the fullest. Cheers.